I did not end my life on a throne. I ended it behind closing palace doors. I remember cold corridors, locked rooms, and footsteps gathering outside the palace like judgment approaching my name. I remember realizing that the army I had invited was no longer mine to command or dismiss. My name was Alexios IV Angelos, son of Isaac II, the emperor they blinded and overthrew. History would remember me as the prince who brought the Fourth Crusade to Constantinople's walls. That memory is not entirely false, but it is not the whole truth. If you begin with the burning city, I become only a foolish young man. If you begin with the broken empire, I become only the hand that opened the gate. But I was not born as the name you remember. I was born inside a palace where gold mosaics could not hide fear. In Constantinople, even an emperor's son learned early that power was never still. The crown looked eternal from a distance, but inside the palace it moved from hand to hand. My father, Isaac II Angelos, had once worn that crown. He had enemies, rivals, debts, failures, and a brother who waited for weakness. In 1195, my uncle Alexios III overthrew him. My father was blinded because in our world, blindness was made into a political sentence. A blind emperor was not only wounded, he was declared unfit for rule. When they took my father's sight, they also took the future I had been taught to expect. I was still young, but I understood the message of the palace. A door could close in one night, and a dynasty could become a prison. The chambers of my childhood became dangerous places in memory. Every icon, every curtain, every polished floor seemed to ask who would betray whom next. I did not grow up in a simple world of rightful kings and loyal servants. I grew up in an empire where legitimacy needed guards, money, allies, and luck. My father's fall taught me that a name alone could not protect a man. It also taught me that a stolen throne could still look legal if enough people bowed. I carried that lesson into exile. Leaving Constantinople was not freedom. For a prince born at the center of the Roman world, exile felt like being pulled out by the roots. The sea was still behind me, the city still stood, but I no longer belonged to it. I carried my father's claim like a wound that other men could inspect. In the West, I learned another truth about power. A prince's grief is heard most clearly when it becomes useful to someone else. Courts listened to me because I was not only a son asking for justice. I was a possible doorway into Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade had not begun for my sake. Its warriors had spoken of Jerusalem, Egypt, holy war, and vows made before God. But crusades were also made of ships, debts, bargains, rivalries, and men who needed payment. Venice had ships, but Venice also had accounts to settle. The Crusaders had vows, but they also had obligations they could not fully pay. By the time my cause reached them, their road had already bent away from purity. I offered them a story they could use. A blinded father, a stolen throne, a young prince asking Christian knights to restore justice. I also offered promises. Money for their debts, soldiers for their cause, obedience to Rome, and support for their crusade. Those promises would later sound impossible. Perhaps they already were. But from exile, a lost throne can make the world look simpler than it is. I believed Constantinople still held the wealth of emperors. I believed that once I entered the palace, authority would return to its proper shape. I believed that if my father was restored, the empire would recognize the correction. I did not understand how deeply the city had changed. I did not understand how little trust remained between Byzantines and Latins. I did not understand that foreign soldiers do not become harmless because a prince calls them allies. When the fleets approached Constantinople, the water itself seemed crowded with fate. Ships filled the Bosporus and the Golden Horn like moving walls. Banners snapped above the decks and armor flashed beneath the hard light. The walls of the city rose before us, ancient, immense, and silent. I looked at them as a son returning home. Many inside the city looked back and saw a trader arriving with strangers. To them, I was not only Isaac's son, I was the young man whose claim came wrapped in Latin steel. They remembered old resentments, old riots, old trade rivalries, and old religious wounds. No speech of mine could erase decades of suspicion. No bloodline could make foreign sales look innocent. Still, my uncle Alexios III could not hold the city. He fled, as rulers sometimes do when the walls remain but courage leaves. My father was brought back into imperial dignity. I was crowned beside him as co-emperor. For a moment, the story looked like restoration. A stolen father returned, a son vindicated, a usurper gone. Yet the victory was already poisoned. I had entered the palace not as a free emperor, but as a debtor. The crusaders had not crossed seas and risked their lives for ceremony alone. They expected the gold I had promised. They expected support, submission, and proof that my words had not been bait. But the treasury was not the treasure house of my imagination. The empire I returned to was strained, suspicious, and tired. Its wealth was scattered, guarded, pledged, or already consumed by years of weakness. A crown could command processions, but it could not summon silver from empty rooms. A coronation could restore a title, but it could not restore trust. I had to pay men who made me emperor. To pay them, I had to squeeze the city that hated them. Every attempt to fulfill my promise made me look more like their servant. Every tax, every seizure, every demand turned more faces away from me. I had imagined the throne as the answer. Instead, I found it was the place where impossible debts came to sit beside me. The Latins waited outside the heart of my empire. The people of Constantinople waited inside it. Each side believed I owed them something no emperor could give. The crusaders wanted gold, troops, and obedience to the bargain. The citizens wanted the foreigners gone. I could satisfy neither without betraying the other. So I stood between two angers, and both grew sharper. My father sat near me, restored in name but diminished in power. He had suffered too much, lost too much, and seen too little of the world now closing around us. Together we appeared as emperors. In truth, we were two shadows inside an old ceremony. The palace still knew how to dress a ruler. The robes, the crowns, the chants, the incense, the jeweled objects all remained. But ceremony cannot hold a city when belief has gone. Outside, resentment moved faster than any order I could sign. The people did not forget that Latin soldiers had helped place me above them. The crusaders did not forget that I had promised more than I could deliver. I began to learn the difference between recovering a throne and ruling an empire. The first can be done with ships. The second requires trust, and I had almost none left. Fires broke out in the city during those months of fear and hatred. Violence between Greeks and Latins deepened the wound. Every flame seemed to light the truth I wished not to see. I had returned home with men my own people feared, and I had promised those men wealth my city could not bear to give. I do not say this to make myself innocent. I say it because guilt has a history. The disaster did not begin with one young man's bargain, but my bargain gave it a body. Before me, the empire was already weakened by rivalry, debt, and mistrust. The Angeloi had not made Constantinople stronger. We had inherited grandeur and spent too much of it defending ourselves from one another. Provincial loyalty had thinned. The army was not what old imperial memory pretended it was. The court had learned intrigue more easily than repair. The West had learned to see our weakness as an invitation. Venice saw routes, markets, and payment. Crusader lords saw debt, opportunity, and a holy cause bending under practical need. I saw my father's stolen throne. Each of us looked at Constantinople and saw what we wanted. That is how disasters gather, not as a single evil thought, but as many desires walking toward the same gate. I told myself that my cause was just. My father had been overthrown and blinded by his own brother. Was I wrong to seek help? Was I wrong to want the throne restored to the line from which it had been taken? These questions stayed with me long after answers became useless. Justice and ruin can sometimes wear the same cloak at the beginning. I wanted to undo a crime. I helped open the way to a greater one. The city began to close around me. Not in a single moment, not with one dramatic sign, but slowly. A servant who would not meet my eyes. A noble who bowed too carefully. A priest whose silence accused me more than any shouted insult. A crowd that no longer sounded like subjects but like witnesses. The crusader envoys became colder. Their patience had an edge. They had counted my promises as if promises were coins already in their hands. When I failed to pay enough, they did not hear difficulty. They heard betrayal. Inside the city, my own people heard every payment as humiliation. They saw sacred objects, noble wealth, and imperial dignity turn toward foreign demands. They did not ask whether I had options. They saw only what my rule cost them. So my crown became a sign of dependence. My name became a wound. I had believed that legitimacy could survive foreign help if the cause was rightful. I was wrong. In Constantinople, a ruler could survive many sins, but not the image of serving outsiders. The more I tried to stand upright, the more I seemed held up by foreign hands. The more I spoke as emperor, the more people heard the crusaders behind my voice. There were moments when I still imagined escape from the trap. Perhaps more money could be raised. Perhaps the crusaders could be satisfied and sent away. Perhaps the city would calm once the foreign army left its sight. Perhaps the old forms of empire would gather around me again. Hope is most dangerous when it has no plan. Mine became smaller each day, but I clung to it, because the alternative was to admit that I had brought my father back only to lose everything. The true turning point was not one battle. It was the death of confidence. It died in unpaid promises. It died in angry markets and whispered churches. It died in the eyes of men who had once needed me and now despised me. It died whenever I realized that commands still left my mouth, but obedience no longer followed naturally. By early 1204, my father was gone or dying within the storm of events. His restoration had been brief, sad, and almost unreal. The man for whom I had risked everything could no longer anchor the throne. Without him, my own claim stood more exposed. The city wanted a defender, not a debtor. The people wanted someone who would face the Latins, not bargain with them. Into that hunger stepped Alexios Ducas, called Mort Zuflos. He understood the mood of the city better than I did. He knew that resistance had become more powerful than legitimacy. He could present himself as the man who would break with the foreigners. I had been useful when foreign armies needed a Byzantine name. Now I was useless to a city that wanted to reject them. The palace turned. It always could. The same halls that had watched my father fall now watched me lose my footing. The same empire that had taught me crowns could be taken proved the lesson again. I was seized and imprisoned. For a second time in my family, power ended behind closed doors. I had crossed seas to restore my father. I had brought fleets to the walls of Constantinople. I had entered the palace in triumph. Now I was trapped inside it, less an emperor than an embarrassment to be removed. History says I died soon after, probably killed after Alexios IV took power. I will not pretend there was grandeur in it. No empire bowed in silence. No vast speech redeemed the failure. A short reign ended in confinement, fear, and a death useful to others. But my death did not close the story I had helped begin. The crusaders remained outside, angry and unpaid. The city had rejected me, but it had not escaped the storm. Alexios V tried to resist, and perhaps he understood the danger more clearly than I had. Yet the break had already gone too far. In April 1204, Constantinople fell to the men who had once carried my claim. The city that had stood for centuries was entered, plundered, and divided. Churches were stripped. Relics were taken. Palaces were opened like bodies. The wealth of the Roman East became spoil in foreign hands. The Fourth Crusade, called for holy war in the East, had devoured the greatest Christian city in the world. That is the shadow under which my name survives, not my childhood, not my father's blindness, not the years of exile, not the fragile hope with which I first saw the walls again, only the result. Alexios IV, the prince who invited the crusaders. Alexios IV, the emperor who could not pay. Alexios IV, the fool who opened the way. There is truth in those names. I will not wash it away. I did invite them. I did promise what I could not safely give. I did mistake a foreign army for an instrument I could set down when finished. I did think justice for my family could be separated from the ambitions of those who helped me. Those were my errors. They were not small. But history becomes lazy when it gives one man a disaster built by many hands. Before my bargain, the empire had already been weakened. Before my crown, the court had already learned to survive by betrayal. Before the crusaders reached our walls, Venice had already pulled their path toward its own interests. Before the sack, Latin and Byzantine suspicion had been growing for generations. I was not the storm. I was the door through which the storm entered. And perhaps that is enough guilt for one life. Still, I ask you to see the human shape beneath the accusation. I was not born wanting to destroy my city. I was a son of a blinded father. I was a prince taught that stolen power could be reversed if the rightful name returned. I was young enough to believe that a throne could heal what violence had broken. I was desperate enough to confuse opportunity with salvation. When I spoke to the crusaders, I did not imagine sacred vessels being torn from churches. I did not imagine my city parceled out like a conquered estate. I did not imagine that the empire I hoped to restore would be weakened beyond recognition. I imagined doors opening. I imagined my father raised again in dignity. I imagined my uncle's betrayal undone. I imagined myself returning not as a conqueror, but as a rightful son. That is the cruelty of memory. It lets the dead remember their intentions, while the living remember only consequences. The people of Constantinople did not owe me forgiveness. They saw the soldiers. They saw the taxes. They saw the foreign demands. They saw the danger I had brought to their streets. If they hated me, their hatred had reasons. If the crusaders despised me, their anger also had reasons. I had made myself necessary to both sides, then failed to satisfy either. A ruler can survive being unloved. He cannot survive being trusted by no one. The image that remains with me is not the crown. It is a map spread across a table, touched by hands that wanted different futures. My hand reached for Constantinople as home. The Venetians saw harbors and accounts. The Crusaders saw payment and passage. My enemy saw a city that must be defended from me. On that table, the empire was already being pulled apart before armies finished the work. I also remember my father's face after blindness. There are wounds that change more than the body. His silence taught me that imperial blood did not make a man safe from humiliation. Perhaps I spent the rest of my life trying to answer that silence. Perhaps every promise I made in the West was spoken to the darkness where my father's eyes had been. I wanted to give him back the world that had been stolen. Instead, I returned him to a throne surrounded by debt and hatred. That may be the deepest part of my failure. Not that I lost power, not that I died young, but that the love of a son became one path by which a city was endangered. I wonder sometimes whether a wiser man would have refused the bargain. A wiser man might have seen that foreign armies bring their own hunger. A wiser man might have known that a bankrupt empire cannot buy back trust. A wiser man might have understood that legitimacy restored by outsiders is already wounded. But history is full of wiser men who arrived too late. I was not one of them. I was young, dispossessed, and surrounded by men older than I was, each with sharper needs. They did not force every word from my mouth. I chose. But choices made in exile are not made in open fields. They are made in narrow rooms, under pressure, with loss behind you and humiliation ahead. That does not excuse me. It explains the shape of the trap. When the palace finally turned against me, I must have understood how my father felt. Not the blindness, but the sudden shrinking of the world. One day men bow. The next day they calculate whether your removal will save them. One day your name is shouted in ceremony. The next day it is spoken quietly as a problem. Power does not always collapse with thunder. Sometimes it disappears from the room before anyone announces it is gone. The guards change their tone. The courtiers stand farther away. The doors close more firmly. The candles burn lower. And the man who was emperor realizes that the title has become an echo. I have been called traitor. I have been called puppet. I have been called the boy who sold Constantinople for a crown. Some of that judgment I must carry. Yet I was also carried by a century's weight, by the fracture between Greek East and Latin West, by the weakness of my dynasty, by the greed of merchants, by the debts of crusaders, by the ambition of nobles, by the desperate belief that a wrong done to my father could be undone without awakening larger wrongs. History likes a single face for catastrophe. Mine was convenient. It was young, imperial, and dead. Dead men cannot argue. Dead men cannot ask whether the living have simplified them. So my name became a hinge. Before Alexios, the crusade still might have gone elsewhere. After Alexios, the road to Constantinople could be explained. That is why I remain useful to the story. I make the disaster easier to tell, but easier is not the same as truer. If I could speak from that narrow place before death, I would not ask to be cleared. I would ask only to be weighed properly. Put my ambition on the scale. Put my desperation there too. Put my father's mutilation, my exile, my promises, my blindness to danger. Then add the debts of Venice, the hunger of armed men, the bitterness between churches, the weakness of the empire, and the long habit of betrayal within our own walls. Only then will the scale begin to look like history. I do not know what I feared most at the end. Perhaps death. Perhaps shame. Perhaps the thought that Constantinople would remember me not as a son returning, but as a curse. A city can survive many enemies. It is harder to survive those who claim to love it and still bring danger to its gates. I claimed to love Constantinople. I did love it in the way exiles love what has been taken from them. But love without judgment can become destructive. Love joined to entitlement can mistake possession for service. I wanted the city to recognize me. I did not first ask whether I had earned the city's trust. There too is guilt. The final loneliness of power is not being hated by enemies. It is realizing that even those who once needed you now need you gone. The crusaders had needed my claim. The city had needed a solution. My father had needed restoration. For a moment, I seemed to answer all of them. Then I became the obstacle in every direction. To the Latins, I was unpaid debt. To the citizens, I was foreign dependence. To the palace, I was danger. To Alexios IV, I was the man whose removal could prove resistance. So the crown passed again. It did not pass cleanly. Crowns rarely do. They drag blood, fear, and old promises behind them. Mine had barely touched my head before it became too heavy to bear. I sometimes think of the Hagia Sophia, not as a monument in a traveler's tale, but as a vast interior of breath, smoke, stone, and prayer. I think of light falling from high windows. I think of voices rising beneath the dome. I think of how small an emperor must look from above. Perhaps every ruler should stand there alone before wearing a crown. Perhaps he would understand that empire is not a jewel to recover, but a burden made of living souls. I did not understand soon enough. I saw rights, claims, family wrongs, and opportunities. I did not see enough of the ordinary people who would pay for imperial return. I did not see the shopkeeper watching foreign soldiers from a doorway. I did not see the priest hiding sacred vessels. I did not see the mother pulling a child away from a street where languages had turned into threats. Or if I saw them, I made their fear smaller than my cause. That is another way rulers fail. They make other people's fears smaller than their own purpose. I cannot tell you that I was only a victim. That would be another lie placed over an old wound. I was used, but I also used others. I was trapped, but I also chose the road into the trap. I was young, but youth does not undo consequence. I loved my father, but love does not excuse the breaking of a city. I wanted justice, but justice pursued without wisdom can become ruin. These are the truths I would carry if I could speak without ceremony. No crown, no incense, no formal title. Only a man looking back at the gate he opened. After the sack, the empire did not vanish completely. Greek rule would return to Constantinople decades later. The city would be recovered in 1261. Historians would write of restoration, exile states, Latin rule, and the long survival of Byzantium. But survival is not the same as being unbroken. Something was taken in 1204 that could not simply be crowned again. Trust was taken. Wealth was taken. Sacred confidence was taken. The old sense that Constantinople stood apart from the storms of the world was taken. My life ended before I saw the full wound. Yet my name was left at its edge. That is the strange punishment of history. A man may die before the worst happens and still be remembered as one of its causes. Perhaps that is fair. Perhaps it is only incomplete. I leave both possibilities before you. If you want a villain, I can be shaped into one. The young emperor who promised too much. The exile who mistook foreigners for saviors. The debtor who taxed his own city to satisfy armed guests. The ruler who lost the trust of everyone around him. All of that is there. But if you want a human being, look closer. See the son of a blinded father. See the prince standing in foreign halls, selling hope because hope was all he had left. See the young man before the walls of Constantinople, believing he was coming home. See the emperor on the throne, hearing both sides demand the impossible. See the prisoner finally understanding that a restored crown can still be a trap. That is the life behind the label. Not innocence, not greatness, not wisdom. Only a chain of fear, ambition, family loyalty, misjudgment, and consequence. I do not ask you to forgive me. Forgiveness belongs first to the city, and the city suffered more than I did. I do not ask you to call me misunderstood, as if misunderstanding could wash stone clean. I ask only that you understand the difference between a monster and a man who failed. A monster destroys because destruction is his desire. I destroyed by reaching for restoration with hands too careless, too desperate, and too blind. In the end, the throne was still there. The palace walls still held their shadows. The sea wind still moved through the golden horn. But my father was gone. I was gone. The empire I thought I could restore was already passing into another form of ruin. When names are written into books, they become easier than lives. Alexios IV, Angelos. A few words, a date, a blame. But a life is longer than its sentence. A life has corridors, silences, bargains, hopes, and moments when the wrong road still looks like the only road home. If history remembers me as the man who opened the gate, then let it also remember this. When I opened it, I believed I was returning to my city. Only too late did I learn that some gates do not lead home. Some gates open inward, and the whole world follows you through.